Have you ever wondered how much humiliation a person can take before they finally snap? I used to ask myself that question every single day. The answer came to me on a Tuesday night in a crowded, upscale bar, surrounded by people who were supposed to be my friends. The air smelled of expensive cologne and spilled beer, and the noise was deafening. But all I could hear was my husband's voice cutting through the laughter like a jagged knife. He was standing by the pool table, holding a drink in one hand and pointing at me with the other, his face twisted into a cruel, mocking grin that made my stomach turn. "Look at her," he announced to the room, his words slurring slightly. "She wouldn't even know how to throw a punch if her life depended on it. She's like a scared little rabbit." His friend, a man I barely knew, laughed loudly and leaned in closer to me, his breath hot against my neck. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat as his hand drifted too low on my waist, a deliberate violation of my space. My husband didn't stop him. He just watched, smiling, waiting for me to crumble like I always did. My entire body went rigid, locked in a state of terrified paralysis that I knew all too well. It's a specific kind of freeze, the kind that starts in your chest and spreads to your fingertips until you feel like a statue made of ice. I wanted to scream, to push the man away, to slap the smirk off my husband's face, but my muscles refused to obey my brain. I looked around the circle of faces, searching desperately for an ally, for someone, anyone, to step in and say this wasn't okay. But they just looked away or chuckled nervously into their drinks, complicit in their silence. They saw me as a prop, a punching bag for their amusement, not a human being with dignity. The pressure to stay quiet was suffocating, a heavy blanket of shame that I had worn for years. My husband knew exactly what he was doing because he had spent our entire marriage training me to be this way. He loved the freeze because it made him feel powerful, like he was the puppeteer and I was just a doll with cut strings. When I first met Mark, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a savior. He was charming, confident, and seemed to have an answer for everything, which felt incredibly safe to a girl who had always had to fight for stability. He opened doors for me, made decisions when I was indecisive, and told me he wanted to take care of me. I mistook his control for leadership and his jealousy for passion. I thought I had found a partner who was strong enough to handle the world, but I didn't realize that his strength required my weakness to exist. He slowly wrapped himself around my life like a vine, choking off my independence so gradually that I didn't even notice the leaves turning brown. He rewrote my reality, convincing me that I was clumsy, forgetful, and incapable of navigating life without him. I fell in love with a mask, a carefully constructed persona designed to lure me in, and by the time the mask slipped, I was already trapped in a cage I had helped him build. The silencing began with small things, little comments that seemed harmless at the time, but were actually bricks in a wall he was building between me and my voice. We would be at dinner, and I would offer an opinion on politics or a movie, and he would chuckle softly, patting my hand like I was a child. "Honey," he would say, with a condescending smile, "you don't really understand how these things work." If I tried to argue, he would talk over me, his voice getting louder and harder, until I just gave up to keep the peace. He needed to be right about everything, from the route we took to the grocery store to the way I folded the laundry. My thoughts became inconveniences to him, obstacles to his dominance. Over time, I stopped sharing them. I learned that silence was safer than ridicule. I learned to make myself small, to nod and agree, to become a shadow in my own home. I buried my voice so deep inside me that I started to forget what it sounded like, which was exactly what he wanted. But there was a secret I kept buried even deeper than my voice, a part of my history that Mark never bothered to ask about. My grandfather wasn't just a migrant worker. In his village back home, he was a master of Wing Chun. When I was bullied in school for my accent and my handmade clothes, he didn't go to the principal or teach me to run away. He took me to the backyard. For years, every single afternoon, he taught me how to redirect force, how to use an opponent's momentum against them, and how to strike with precision rather than brute strength. He taught me that a small woman could defeat a large man if she knew where to hit and had the patience to wait for the right moment. I spent hours punching bags of sand until my knuckles bled and calloused, learning to tolerate pain. I learned to read body language, to sense aggression before a punch was thrown. Mark saw a fragile wife, but under the layers of fear, there was a dormant fighter waiting to wake up. When my grandfather died, a part of me died with him. On his deathbed, he made me promise one thing. He held my hand, his grip still surprisingly strong, and whispered, "Promise me you will never use what I taught you out of anger. You fight only to protect life. You fight only when there is no other choice." I gave him my word, weeping as I promised to be a woman of peace. I took that vow so seriously that I locked that part of myself away in a mental box. I convinced myself that being a good wife meant being passive, that fighting back, even verbally, was a violation of my promise to him. I confused pacifism with submission. I thought I was honoring his memory by enduring Mark's emotional abuse without retaliation. I didn't realize that my grandfather never intended for me to be a doormat. He taught me to defend myself, not to let someone destroy my soul slowly over a dinner table. I had twisted his wisdom into a set of chains that kept me bound to a man who despised me. The abuse didn't stay verbal forever, because control is an addiction that always needs a higher dose. It started with subtle physical intimidation, things he could easily explain away as accidents or clumsiness. He would block a doorway so I couldn't leave a room, towering over me with his chest puffed out. He would grab my arm a little too hard when he wanted my attention, leaving bruises that looked like fingerprints. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he would say. "You're just so sensitive." He would accidentally bump into me while I was carrying hot coffee, or slam a cabinet door shut inches from my face just to see me flinch. It was psychological warfare designed to keep my nervous system in a constant state of high alert. I lived on the edge of a precipice, never knowing when the shove would come. I wanted to fight back, my hands twitching with the muscle memory of 1,000 strikes. But the promise to my grandfather held me back. I was trapped between my vow of peace and my instinct to survive. Then came the invitation that felt more like a summons. Mark came home on a Tuesday, tossing his keys on the counter with a clatter. "Get dressed," he said, not looking at me. "The guys are meeting at the bar downtown. You're coming." My heart sank because I knew what these nights were like. They were performances where I was the prop. "I have a headache," I tried to say, my voice barely a whisper. He turned on me, his eyes cold and dead. "I didn't ask how you felt. I said you're coming. Don't embarrass me by being antisocial." He wanted an audience. He wanted to show off his obedient little wife to his friends, to prove that he was the alpha male who had everything under control. I put on the dress he liked, the one that was slightly uncomfortable, and applied the makeup he preferred. As we drove to the bar in silence, I felt a heavy knot of dread in my stomach, a premonition that tonight was going to be different, that the tightrope I had been walking was finally going to snap. We walked into the bar, and he immediately shifted into his charming guy mode, high-fiving his friends and ordering a round of shots. I stood by his side, clutching my purse, trying to blend into the wallpaper. It didn't take long for the spotlight to turn on me. He started telling a story about how I had ruined dinner the night before, exaggerating my mistake until it sounded like a comedy sketch. "She burned water, I swear to God," he roared, slapping the table. The table erupted in laughter. Emboldened by their reaction, he escalated. He started mocking my accent, which only came out when I was nervous, mimicking my voice in a high-pitched, degrading whine. "Listen to her," he sneered. "She sounds like a cartoon character." I stared at the floor, my face burning with shame, feeling the heat of their eyes on me. He wasn't just teasing me, he was dissecting my dignity for sport. He was stripping me bare in front of strangers, feeding his ego on my humiliation. I bit my lips so hard I tasted copper, praying for the floor to open up and swallow me whole. Then, the line was crossed. One of Mark's friends, a guy named Dave who had been staring at me all night with glassy eyes, decided that my husband's disrespect was an invitation. He laughed at Mark's joke and then leaned over, draping his heavy arm around my shoulders. "Aw, don't be so hard on her, Mark," Dave slurred, his hand sliding down my back, lower and lower until it rested firmly on my hip, squeezing possessively. "She's cute when she's scared." It wasn't a friendly touch, it was predatory. I froze, my eyes darting to Mark, pleading silently for him to stop this. Mark looked at Dave's hand on my body, then looked at me, and he shrugged. He took a sip of his drink and smiled. He did nothing. In that moment, the betrayal hit me harder than any physical blow. He wasn't just a bad husband, he was willing to trade my safety for his friend's approval. He was letting another man violate me just to maintain his status as the cool guy who didn't care. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into a thick, syrupy silence. I looked at Dave's leering face, then at Mark's indifferent smirk, and something inside me fractured. But it wasn't a break, it was an opening. A memory surged from the depths of my mind, clear and sharp as a diamond. I saw my grandfather standing in the backyard, his hands clasped behind his back. "You fight only to protect life," he had said. For years, I thought that meant protecting others or protecting my physical body from death. But looking at Mark, I realized that my life, my spirit, my dignity, the essence of who I was being murdered right here in this bar. Protecting life meant protecting me. I realized I didn't owe silence to a man who fed me to wolves. I didn't owe peace to a man who waged war on my heart. The promise wasn't a cage, it was a key, and I had just turned it in the lock. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, deadly calm. I wasn't the rabbit anymore. Dave's hand squeezed my hip again, and he whispered something filthy in my ear. I didn't flinch this time. My body moved before my conscious mind even gave the order, reacting with the fluidity of muscle memory that had been dormant for a decade. I reached up, grabbing his wrist with one hand and his elbow with the other. In one smooth, explosive motion, I twisted. Dave yelped as his joint locked, his balance compromised instantly. I pivoted my hips, using his own weight to swing him around and slammed him face first onto the pool table. The sound of his body hitting the felt was a dull thud that echoed in the sudden quiet. He tried to scramble up, but I was faster.
I twisted his arm behind his back, applying just enough pressure to keep him pinned, staring straight ahead. It took less than 3 seconds. I hadn't thrown a punch. I hadn't screamed. I had simply neutralized the threat with the efficiency of a master. I stood over him, my breathing steady, while he groaned in pain and shock.
The laughter died instantly. It didn't just fade, it was severed, replaced by a silence so profound you could hear the ice melting in the glasses. The music seemed to fade into the background noise. Every eye in the vicinity was glued to me. Mark's mouth was hanging open, his drink halfway to his lips, frozen in a tableau of disbelief. His friends were staring with wide, terrified eyes, unable to comprehend that the scared little rabbit had just taken down the biggest guy in the group without breaking a sweat. The dynamic in the room shifted so violently it was palpable. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the most dangerous person in the room, and they knew it. The air crackled with a new energy, respect mixed with fear. I released Dave's arm and stepped back, smoothing my dress as if I had just brushed off a piece of lint. Dave scrambled off the table, holding his shoulder, backing away from me like I was a viper. I looked at them, meeting each gaze, daring them to laugh now. I turned to look at my husband. The color had drained from his face, leaving him pasty and gray. His arrogance, which had been so solid just moments ago, had collapsed into a pile of confusion. He looked at me like I was a stranger, like an alien had beamed down and taken over his wife's body. What the hell was that? He stammered, his voice trembling. He realized in that second that he never really knew me. He thought he had broken me, but he had just been standing on a landmine for years without knowing it. He looked at Dave, then back at me, searching for the fear he used to control me, but he couldn't find it. His authority, built on the premise of my weakness, disintegrated. He wasn't the alpha male anymore. He was just a man standing next to a warrior he had foolishly underestimated. I saw the terror in his eyes, not fear of physical pain, but the terrifying realization that he had lost his power over me forever. I grew up training in Wing Chun, I said, my voice calm and clear, cutting through the silence. My grandfather taught me how to handle men who think they can take whatever they want. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I spoke with the authority of someone who knows exactly who she is. I promised him I would never use it unless I had to. Tonight, you made me have to. I looked at Dave, who was rubbing his shoulder, looking at the floor. "Don't ever touch me again," I said simply. Then I looked at Mark, "And don't you ever disrespect me again." I was reframing the narrative in real time. This wasn't a crazy outburst. This was disciplined self-defense. This wasn't violence. It was a boundary being enforced. The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wasn't the crazy wife. I was the disciplined survivor. Mark opened his mouth to speak, to try and spin this back into his control, but he closed it again, realizing he had absolutely nothing to say. The apologies started coming, awkward and mumbled. Dave, still massaging his arm, wouldn't look me in the eye. "I'm sorry," he muttered. I was just messing around." The other friends nodded quickly, suddenly finding their shoes very interesting. "Yeah, sorry about that," one of them said. "We didn't know." They were embarrassed, shaken by the reality check I had just delivered. They were bullies who only felt strong when the victim was weak, and now that the equation had changed, they were scrambling to retreat. Mark stood there, isolated. He tried to laugh it off, a weak, pathetic sound. "She's full of surprises, right, guys?" he tried,
but nobody laughed. His attempt to reclaim the room fell flat. His friends looked at him differently now, seeing him not as the leader, but as the guy who almost got his friend's arm broken because he couldn't control his wife, or protect her. The pathetic nature of his cruelty was exposed for everyone to see.
We stayed for another 20 minutes, mostly because I refused to run away. I ordered a water and stood by the bar, and the change in the atmosphere was incredible. When I walked to the bathroom, people moved out of my way. The bartender served me immediately with a polite nod of deference. Mark's friends spoke to me in respectful tones, asking me genuine questions, afraid to cross me. It wasn't the kind of respect that comes from love, it was the kind that comes from a healthy dose of fear. But at that moment, I didn't care. It was clarity. For the first time in my marriage, I was being treated as an equal, not because I had asked for it, but because I had demonstrated that the cost of disrespecting me was too high. Mark stood beside me, silent and sullen, drinking his beer. He knew the balance had shifted permanently. He was no longer the sun I orbited around. I was a planet with my own gravity, and he was just debris floating nearby. Driving home, the car was silent, but it wasn't the fearful silence of the drive there. It was the silence of a decision being made. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. I realized that the respect I had gained in that bar was just a symptom of a larger truth. I could survive without him. I didn't need his protection because I could protect myself. I didn't need his validation because I knew my own worth. The fear that had kept me trapped, the fear of being alone, the fear of his anger, had vanished the moment I threw Dave onto that table. Realized that silence was no longer an option in my marriage. If I stayed, it would be on my terms, with full respect. But looking at Mark's sulking profile, I knew I wouldn't stay. I had outgrown the cage. My grandfather's spirit was awake now, and it refused to go back to sleep. I packed my bags the next morning while Mark was at work. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe him an explanation. The memory of his face in that bar was closure enough. As I walked out the door into the bright sunlight of a new life, I thought about what it means to be strong. For so long, I thought strength was endurance, taking the hits and staying standing. But I realized that real strength doesn't always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it waits quietly in the dark, patiently sharpening its blade. It reveals itself only when someone makes the fatal mistake of confusing your patience for weakness. Mark thought he was breaking a glass doll, but he was actually forging steel. He wanted to humiliate me, to make me small, but all he did was remind me of how big I really am. He never saw it coming, but I think, deep down, he will be looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life, wondering what other surprises the quiet ones are hiding.